In this episode, I'm going to be running custom clutch lines and brake lines and solving a few problems along the way. Stay tuned. Before I get too far into this, running the lines and things like that, I want to go back in time a little bit and show some of the issues I ran into with the clutch master cylinder. The amount I move my clutch here is not quite enough. I don't need that much, but it would be nice to double that stroke length, just so you can get the most control out of your clutch possible. I was trying to think of ways I could save space. One way I could do it, since I have this long pedal stroke, is I could bring my master cylinder inside and bring it up towards the top of the dash. I didn't really want the master cylinder inside, so I kind of killed that idea. The other option is I need to somehow get my motion coming from towards the top of my axis so that this pedal will move more than this will move. So the ratio will change a bit. That's what I'm trying to figure out how to do. And so I was looking online, and one of the ways you can achieve that is I can actually tilt the angle at which my master cylinder is mounted so that the arc path of the master cylinder is a smaller circle than the arc path of the pedal. Ideally, to change the ratio, you just want to move the master cylinder vertically up without changing its mount angle, because you can run into some issues bleeding the master cylinder, things like that. There's ways to get around it, but in my case I pretty much had to angle it because the brake booster was mounted pretty much right above where I had my clutch master cylinder mounted. There's just not a lot of room on a Starlet to mount stuff. In this shot you can see that I've cut away my old mount and re-tacked in place with a couple patch panels the master cylinder at a steeper angle. The problem I ran into here was now I needed the plunger length to be extended, so I had to figure out a way around that as well. So what I've been struggling with is the fact that I need my master cylinder perpendicular to the arc of this pedal travel. And so the problem with that, the reason why I can't do it, is because I can't figure out a way to place this where it's going to be in that proper location because of the length of the rod on the master cylinder. So I came up with a solution. These are the parts that go on the end of the plunger for the master. Since they're threaded, I can put a coupling nut on the end and use a piece of threaded rod to extend the length, which will hopefully get me to the right angle that's close to perpendicular to my travel of this pedal right here. Here you can see the finished product after I changed the ratio on the pedal and extended out my plunger. I have a ton more travel and I'll have a lot more control over the clutch with this mod. Here's some smartphone pics of the clutch master cylinder I used because I did a terrible job planning my B-roll. The reason this clutch master cylinder is so tricky to mount is because the Starlet initially came with a clutch cable, but the J160 that came with the beams uses a slave cylinder, so I needed to convert the system to hydraulic. The reason I chose this particular master cylinder is because it was super compact and had a remote reservoir. That's pretty much the only type that was going to fit in my application. It's also all metal and very available. They use it in a lot of Honda cars, so I think I got this from like a mid-90s Civic. There'll be a link in the description if you're curious. It does seem to be working, but I'm not sure if I would recommend it. The jury's still out on that. Alright, so this guy right here, I tightened up all these connections. I put lock nuts on either side of this coupling nut. Yeah, this guy's locked down by its factory nut, so this should be good to go. I just wanted to add this detail to make sure that you put jam nuts if you're going to do this method of extending your plunger, just because you obviously don't want these things to come loose. To get a good starting point in running the hard lines, I screwed the hard line that was originally on the Civic that I pulled that master cylinder from, just to get a rough feel for how I needed to bend the lines. My philosophy being here to use old hard lines or wire to make a template so that we can use new 3/16 hard line to bend the actual lines for the car. Since I'm using a Ford rear end out of a late 90s Explorer, that came with rear disc brakes, so I need to run a proportioning valve so that the right amount of pressure goes to the front and the back brakes. I'm using an adjustable Willwood proportioning valve, So I'm trying to put it in a place that's easy to get to. This looks like a pretty good spot. For now, I'm using the factory Starlet front brakes. So I'm reusing the front short hard lines that go on the inside of the fender and the flex lines that go to the calipers themselves. When I swapped in the 3SGE engine, I actually removed the clutch slave cylinder just so I'd have a little bit more wiggle room when I was trying to get it in the engine bay. But since it's off anyways, I decided to take it to the vise so that I could remove the cut flex line. This seemed like it would be easier to do off the car. The reason I needed to remove the damaged flex line was so I could measure the threads and find a replacement flex line that would work. I ended up using 3/8/24 for all the SAE fittings, like the ones for the 8.8 rear end.
Also, the proportioning valve came with SAE fittings.
And M10x1 fittings for all of the Toyota parts, so it was pretty simple. I then reunited the slave cylinder with the J160 transmission, which is on the passenger side of my left-hand drive car. While I was down here, I also ran one of the original Starlet ground wires that was still connected to the body, just bolted it to the back side of the transmission. Next, I decided to mark out my proportioning valve position so I had a good idea of what I needed to bend the lines around. Alright, so I made this spacer. It's going to sit right about there. This guy is going to go right here. You just stand off. Now I need to put a nut zert in there. So I got my little installer tool here. I did eventually get the riv nut in, but I spent so much time trying to get riv nuts in with the washer method that I just do not recommend it overall. I'm getting a tool after this. So here you can see I got the spacer installed. I had nuts welded on the back side where the proportioning valve sits, and the two holes on the side are bolted to the riv nuts on the firewall. After I got my proportioning valve mounted, I switched gears to working back on the rear calipers. Now, I already took these apart and spray painted them black. The reason I didn't finish the job was I was waiting for a seal because it turns out I had the wrong seal. It's helpful on some of these projects, like the brakes is a pretty big project, so you can section down to smaller bits. And if you run into a snag, you can move on to the other part and kind of meet in the middle. It's been a while since I've been under here. Oh, that's right, we have to rebuild these guys too, alright. I don't have too much advice here. General principle is remove the retaining pins, then there's springs everywhere and you got your adjuster on the bottom. The top springs on the backside are probably the most difficult part to remove. This is also a good time just to shout out and remind you that this is a very safety oriented system in your car, so use your best judgment when you're doing these repairs. I went ahead and installed my replacement brake shoes the same way the old ones came off. Installing is definitely a little bit harder than removing, but once you get the hang of it, it's not too big of a deal. The biggest thing is you want to make sure that everything's functioning correctly and you got the parts on the same exact way they were assembled in the first place. This guy moves around freely. You can kind of pry on the e-brake a little bit, get a little movement, so I think everything is good. That part of the install. I did a little touch up on the dust cover because I think that when I got this from the junkyard they painted it orange to mark it. Now I got my new / old rotor. Just been sitting around collecting, getting surface rust on it. This project's been around so long. Put this guy on here. Beautiful, nice new rotor. And then I need my slides, which I'm going to put the that grease on. Put it actually on the surface here. So using this stuff called disc brake quiet was fine to use here underneath the metal, but you shouldn't use this on any sliding surface. It's not like a brake grease. It's more of just a film that sits in between metal to metal contact surfaces. Like the bolt sleeves, I guess, boots, not sure what they are, return boots for my caliper. So these guys go, slide right in here, and put a little bit of silicone on them to get them to slide in easy. Cool. So that guy's in. Well, this is the wrong caliper. But I want my bleeder to be up, and this bleeder is down right now. See, that bleeder is right there. I want it to be in the upper portion so that I can bleed the brakes without any issues. I'm gonna install everything on this one. Hopefully this works out. So to get everything to fit right, I had to like hammer those metal slides in to get them to seat all the way in place. The next problem I ran into is that the pads weren't symmetrical and I wasn't sure which way the tab was supposed to point on the end of the pads. I need to know if that goes up or down. First I tried to install the pad with the tab pointing either direction, but I was able to install either way. You would think they would make it symmetrical if it mattered. Or if it didn't matter, they'd make it symmetrical. Lucky for me in this case, I have an Explorer that has the same rear end, so I just looked to see which way the pads were installed in that. Alright, so I just checked, and on my Explorer, I ran it vertical. Right now this upper part is up, and that is how I ran it. So that means I need to swap this portion. It probably would work this way too, but I've been running my Explorer for a little while now and haven't had any issues, so I'm just going to do it the same way I did it there. So yeah, there actually is some difference. So this guy right here has this cutout, so those have to be lined up on both sides for it to work, I think. Now I'm just installing the pin sleeves, and then the calipers will be ready to put in the car. See, it's working and moving well, sealing off that surface. So push these guys back apart, make sure this guy's on the top, and the bleeder is up top as well. Push back these slides so that fits the caliper. It should be good to go right there. Then I just did a wash, rinse, repeat on the passenger side. Next I made these C-channel shapes with the nut welded to the backside so that I could weld that mount to the axle housing. This is to secure the inside of the flex line that goes to the caliper. I made one for each side. Alright, so this right here is my flex line to hard line that came with the Explorer. I'm actually going to be reusing this flex line because budgeting. It would be nice to replace this, and I will someday, but not today. Okay, so this is the passenger side flex line. So these guys right here, nut welded on the bottom. I will weld this whole assembly to the axle. So this will be welded to the axle. This will go to the caliper like so. And that will screw on there so that there's some flex. So when you have to change caliper, do the service the brakes, I'm gonna go start figuring out where I need to weld these on, and cleaning off some of the paint so that I have the surface to weld to. Might look like I'm fumbling around just because I can't see everything you can see. There's a copper washer. It goes underneath this guy. With that guy in there, there's another copper washer. It goes right in there. Now I can mark where I need to install this guy. I think this is just outside of the view of where you can see. I'll put it like it's gonna be just like that. I'm putting it behind the shock here though, in a way that I have a clear path, and also there's kind of, I don't have too much flex in my hose, so you know, maybe I like something kind of like that actually. It's a little further than I grinded though, so I'm gonna need to kind of prep that a little more, but I think that's a more gradual bend. I like it. Cool, let those cool down and I'll start making some brake lines. Alright, so I screwed down the rubber lines, and I replaced the mock-up line with the new one on the driver's side. Now I'm going to bend this old hard line so I have a guide for my new one. So on a factory Explorer rear end, there's a hard line that goes from one side to the other, and it's fed through the rubber line that has a T. The hard line I'm straightening out right now is that line that links the two rear brakes. I'm actually going to be using a very similar setup. I'm using the factory rubber lines on both sides, and I'm just going to make a slightly shorter one because I shortened the rear end. So I'm thinking I need to bend right about here. So I'm gonna go bend that up a little bit. It took quite a few tries bending this template piece to get it where I like, but it was definitely helpful to screw in one side of the flex line just to suspend the hard line and make sure everything was where I wanted it. Alright, so the ends of these rubber lines, they need to go into rigid mount so that this portion can flex, but the hard line doesn't flex. And so I found this for the Toyota line on a, what's that thing called? It's the big Toyota SUV. But I couldn't find one for the factory Ford style line. I did find a removable bracket, but it doesn't work. What I'm going to do, because basically the way the Ford one works is it's like a hex shape, and a 5/8 hex hole is what I need to make. Since I can't make a hexagon hole, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this piece of flat bar in half, and I'll make half of a hex on two sides. While I'm waiting for that to cool down, I'm going to start straightening out some tube. I finally got my template into a shape that I like, so now I'm bending the new line to match the template. I straightened out in the first chunk of line as much as I could without the coil hitting the ground, so I could still use my flaring tool. Flaring with these cheap auto parts style flaring tools is a bit of a mix of art and science because, you know, you have to develop a perfect system and nothing can go wrong for it to work every time. The biggest things for me are make sure your cuts are clean and that you're using lube. Once I had my first tube nut on, I started matching up the template to the fresh line, and I marked the start of where I need to make my first bend. If you've never ran brake lines before, don't let this quick editing fool you. This is a tricky job and it takes a lot of time and practice. I think this particular line I had to do again because my template was like an inch too short. So I'm not gonna make you watch that again, but yeah, it's a pain. I do have to say though, once you get your brake line bent up in shape how you exactly want it, you don't make any mistakes, everything's pressure tested to perfection, no leaks, it's a pretty good feeling. Alright, I'm not sure how well you can see this, but I got my two halves here of this plate, which are gonna sandwich in this guy right here. Let's see what I can do to clamp these two together so it's a better picture. Alright, I got these vice grips together, these two sides. And that actually seems pretty good. It looks like I'm probably gonna need to grind off a little bit. I'm not sure, but yeah, I think I can weld these together. So I'll kind of carve a channel so I can get good weld adhesion, and then weld these together and then bend up a bracket so that this guy can go up in here, and there's no issues where our hard line's going to be bending. Alright, so here's my plate after it's been welded together. It fits really nice in there, so I'm pretty happy with that. I also got my clip here to see kind of what I'm going to need to do to get it to fit properly. Yeah, with enough coercion, that's gonna go. I think I am gonna grind it down a little bit just to make it a little bit easier. All right, so I ground it down. Yeah, so when I wiggle that around, it fits in there. I think I'll put a line right about there, so that I know kind of where that I can bend this guy out.
Here I'm making a mounting hole for the bracket so I can attach it to the floor. Here you can see I welded up my bend line, and now I'm just grinding off any excess spatter.
Okay, so you can see I've cleared out this area, this guy right here. I'm gonna go ahead and put this guy in here, weld it up, and I'll be able to use a nut on the underneath of the car to attach my bracket. So I got this guy right here all painted up and ready to go. Nice. Yeah, that's pretty good actually. I really like that fit. So before I install this guy though, I'm going to drill out the other holes. There's 2 holes in that bracket. So I'm going to match drill the other one from the bottom side, just by feel. And this guy will go in for good. Well, you can see the bracket there. It's not a very good angle, but you can see something of what's going on. I like to drill holes in my car just by feel. I think that's the best way to do it. It's the most pure. That's in the hole. I just drill, right? Now I'll tack weld a bolt in there.
After that smoke show, the nut was pretty hot, so I gave it a quick spritz so I could take the nut off without burning my hand.
Alright, so that guy's on there. Alright, so I got my first bend here, and now I'm going to match this loop. So I have a scheme here, we'll see how well it works. I'm going to bend around the socket, is my plan. Alright, that looks pretty good. I like.
After I matched my new bends to my template piece, I fit it back up on the car and cut it to its run length. Then I slid on the tube nut so I didn't forget, and went about flaring the second side.
Looks good. I need to tighten this guy up and then we'll be done with this line.
Just as I was getting in the groove, one of my wing nut ears broke off. If you notice closely in the videos, I've actually welded these together before. I think it's some sort of cast iron based material because when it fractures, it always breaks in half and reveals a really grainy surface. Welding doesn't seem like the best strategy, but if a magnet sticks to it, I'm usually able to weld it back together. Might not always be permanent, but it did the job here.
Alright, so right now I'm working on this guy right here, which is my bracket. Or my rubber line here, kind of slides right in there. And then I got the clip on the other side. You can kind of see right there is like the clutch hard line, and then it's gonna go to the rubber line. I need to figure out a mounting system. Alright, so the lighting's terrible, but there you can kind of see the flex line setup. From the top side there you can see that bracket that's on the inside of the frame rail. Right next to it is our pre-fuel rail filter. I did some soul searching on this whole setup. I was going to try to run the clutch kind of underneath the heater hoses, but I don't know why. I mean, there's plenty of room for both the brake and the heater to go above the heater right back here. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and make a junction right here. Without a junction or a union in the brake line, it just becomes too big of a large spaghetti monster to fit in the car. I'll put the junction in a very accessible point that splits up the one continuous line. Yeah, I'm just gonna cut it right there so I'll make a mark so I can make my junction. I'm gonna use this guy, I think, to kind of bend around some stuff and see what kind of shape I come up with. Okay, I think that's the ticket right there, actually. Right there. I'll cut and flare both ends. Should be good to go. Alright, I got this guy flared. Just gonna string it in here. Here's a shot of the hard line going into the clutch flex line. Now I'm working on my passenger side front brake, which is going to parallel the clutch hard line on the firewall. I decided to remove the line that goes to my proportioning valve just so it's easier to mock up the template I'm making. It's pretty close. This bend needs to be pretty tight. And it's sort of a compound bend because I'm going back and down. Alright, so this is my first attempt at this guy right here. So I'm making the short cable and then it will go into a union underneath the vehicle. Alright, should be good now. So a couple small hand bends, and yeah, that's where I want it, so go ahead and flare the other side. Alright, so I got my flare here, or my newly flared other end. I'm just going to pre-put the union on while it's out, it'll be easier that way.
So this union I'm putting on right now is going to go underneath the car right past the firewall. Next, I'm going to bend the line that goes all the way from that to the flex line on my rear axle.
Alright, so I created this big general shape that I can follow. It just needs to be a little bit longer. About hang loose symbol on each side. Alright, so I just cut and installed hopefully the last flare fitting, of course unless something leaks. So I'm going to go install this and then we can get to bench bleeding the master cylinders. I need to bleed my master cylinders. So here I have my clutch master cylinder. This is EPDM hose, which from my understanding is resistant to brake fluid. And then I have right here a little piece of brake line, which I'm going to cut.
The reason you have to bleed your master cylinders is just to get all the air out of the system. So I just attached a short piece of tube, then I put a flex line on that so I could just kind of pump all the fluid through the system back into the reservoir until all the bubbles are gone. The reason my clutch and brake master cylinder both probably have air in them is because they've just been sitting, not connected to any brake lines, so all of that fluid can just kind of leak out. It's also good practice, this is probably old fluid, just so to get some new fluid pumped into the system. Usually when people talk about bleeding their brakes, they're talking about bleeding the slave cylinders or calipers at the wheel itself. But right here what we're doing is bench bleeding the master cylinders.
This is an old rod from another master cylinder that I have. You always use it like a rounded off screwdriver bit, something like that.
Here I adjusted the angle of the master cylinder up and down, just to make sure the air didn't get trapped in any of the corners of the master cylinder.
You spill any brake fluid on painted surfaces, you want to get that off quickly because it doesn't take long before it starts eating into the paint. Alright, we'll get on to bleeding the brakes.
So once I started bleeding the system, I immediately started to see some leaks pop up. The first problem was the clutch line, and it was the connection between the hard line and the flex line right by the slave cylinder.
Recut off that line and reflare that guy. It's weird that that flare looks pretty good. I wanted to make sure this was actually the problem. So I have this old brake fluid here, and I got this like big syringe. It's like a 300 milliliter syringe. I'm just injecting brake fluid through this line. It actually went up the top the other side. But you can see that is a bad flare nut on there. So I'm not sure exactly what happened, but it's bad, so I'm going to go ahead and replace it. I verified that that's the issue.
I said this wasn't going to be an in-depth flaring tutorial, but I do find that WD-40 works really well as a flaring lubricant. It's less messy than brake fluid and works just as well, if not better. After I fixed the leak in my clutch system, started in the brakes, and had some leaks there as well.
Got a leak right there. So I'm gonna go ahead and reflare this guy. Please press the brakes. Yeah, so it's right there. Actually, let's loosen it up. Make sure it's seated properly. It's already leaking, so I know that much. Kind of wiggle around there. See where it wants to go. Tighten it up. Alright, still leaking pretty profusely. I have another washer that came with that. So I'm just gonna stack that underneath there and see what that does.
So when I bought the replacement rubber flex line for the driver's side, some of the reviews said that the copper washers weren't thick enough, and it appears to be the case. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take one of the thin copper washers I use because I lost one of the original ones, and I'm actually gonna stack two on top of each other and see if that holds up.
Alright, brake assistant. Cycle it a couple times. Yep, that was our problem.
After that, I just went around and bled the system, so When you're bleeding the brakes, you always want to start from the furthest caliper from your master cylinder and end on the closest one. Like I mentioned before, this is a ton of work, and if you don't have the right flaring tool set up like I do, I have just a cheapo set you can get at any auto parts store. You might have to reflare some lines a couple times before you get everything correct. But once you're done, you know that you did the brake job yourself. You ran the lines the way you wanted it, in my case, in a very serviceable way, which is super important to me because I want to enjoy working on cars. I don't want it to be this really big hassle every time, something breaks and you have to fix it. I think that's a good time to wrap things up. I wanted to include a bunch of e-brake stuff in this episode, but I think it would be good to go into detail on that, so I'll save that for the next episode. Here you can see a little teaser of what I'm going to be doing next. I think it's a pretty creative way. It's modifications on some methods I've used before, but kind of dialing it a little bit more. One more quick thing I wanted to mention is I'm playing around with some merch ideas. I ordered a couple prototype hats. I know this is still a small channel, but I want to rep it, so you'll see me wear this hat in the videos. Tell me what you guys think. I am considering changing the name just because scrap metal made is a lot of common words strung together, so searching is difficult. I do really like the ethic that the name scrap metal made evokes, but I'm playing around with some other ideas. A leading contender is Alchemy R&D, which I also think is pretty cool because alchemy is like changing something from one state to another. A lot of people call to mind the poppers, which were people who are trying to, turn lead into gold, things like that to kind of swindle people. But the word alchemy has a lot broader and more practical sense, which I think turns it into a pretty cool term. If you like this content and want to see more, consider liking and subscribing. I really want to grow this channel. I hope you all are doing well in these crazy times, and I will see you soon.